This is the Multifaith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multifaith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged to have as a guest today, Benno van den Toren. And I'm going to read a little bit of his bio here. He is professor of intercultural theology at the Protestant Theological University, and that's in the Netherlands. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation of the city there. He is taught in French-speaking Africa and at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University. He's author or co-author of a number of books, including Christian Apologetics as Cross-Cultural Dialogue and Reasons for My Hope, Responding to Non-Christian Friends. Today, we're going to be discussing his new book with co-author Kang-San Tan titled Humble Confidence, a Model for Interfaith Apologetics. And for those of you watching on YouTube, there's the cover of the fine book. Professor, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
It's good to have you here. I have been enjoying the book, and I've been following the breadcrumbs back to other examples of your work to take advantage of there. I'd like to begin on a personal note. Can you describe your background in theology and how you brought not only your background in your studies, but the places in which you've studied and reflected, and how you brought that to bear on the book?
Yeah. I'm from the Netherlands, grew up in the Reformed tradition there, was as a young person, because of my own personal history, I think greatly interested in apologetics, because I felt that for my own growth in faith, I needed to deal with many of the intellectual questions that were facing me. Then I wrote in relation to that a PhD thesis on Karl Barth and apologetics, because Karl Barth was, in our context, the main critic of apologetics. And people said, if you need apologetics, you don't have true faith, because faith is based on Christ. Actually, the main thing I concluded from that research was that Barth rightly argued that apologetics can be done in some way. He didn't call it apologetics, but that if we do it, it should always refer to Christ as the basis of our faith. And that much Western apologetics doesn't work because it presupposes a basis of our faith outside Christ in a modern Enlightenment rationalism. And actually that came to have a new meaning when closely after finishing that PhD, my wife and I were sent by a mission to the Central African Republic, French-speaking Africa. And one of the things I was teaching was Christian apologetics. And I discovered actually that a lot of the apologetic books I'd taken with me and the arguments I'd come across in the West were not at all relevant in that context, because people were asking entirely different questions. And then actually, my engagement with Barth helped me in a different way, because I realized that we need to bring people to Christ, but they come from very different contexts, and none of these find in themselves, a basis for faith in Christ. We need to find a basis in Christ, but yet there may be various bridges to be built. And of course, Karl Barth was very critical of those bridges, but I think if we have a solid belief in creation, we should allow for those bridges. But what those are of course greatly shaped by the cultural context in which people find themselves. There is something universal about human beings, but there is no universal human being. Every human being you encounter is deeply shaped by a cultural tradition. So that led me to writing this book on apologetics as cross-cultural dialogue, taking the rootedness, the cultural rootedness, and the rootedness in community of people much more serious. And then I came to know Kang-San Tan, and we thought that actually we would also need that in relating to people from other religions. And that then leads to this book about apologetics in relation to people with deep religious roots in other communities, in other traditions.
It's a fascinating backstory. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you came to work with Kang-San Tan? And can you talk about those pieces of the puzzle? He is in email communications with me referred to you as the theologian in this, and he brings the cultural. But I think you both obviously have aspects of that. It's together, even though you may have areas of specialization.
Yeah, so Kang-San Tan basically came from with his experience as a missiologist focusing on interreligious relations. My focus was more on apologetics. So in that sense, we had combined experiences and or different experiences, different theological baggage. But a shared sensitivity, which we discovered when we met first in Vancouver, later in Oxford, and then again in Malaysia, where our paths sort of crossed. And there is also a difference. When you think about interreligious apologetics, you realize that you can never cover that as a single author. And when we thought about more reflection on this, we thought maybe you need sort of a volume in which you ask specialists knowing these different religions. But then we realized actually that there is such a need for a deeper thinking about what apologetics is, that it would be better to write it with a small team of two. And then our experiences also combine that Kang-San has a lot of experience with Asian religions because he's from a Chinese theologian from Malaysia originally, now working in the UK. I had much more experiences, say, in a more secular context in Europe, where I grew up, and with primal religions in Africa, where Islam was also a major conversation partner. So together we felt also we could cover a number of main religious traditions.
Let's talk about it may seem like a minor issue, but for folks who work in this area, it's an area of concern. And you talk about the definition of interfaith in the first part of the book. You're talking about interfaith apologetics, especially in American, and I think in the UK context. Interfaith, and I'm speaking in a generalization, it is a like-minded group of people from different religious traditions who want to work together. And in those contexts, apologetics and persuasion is just completely off limits. You're not using interfaith in that kind of definitional meaning.
No, we've been doubting between interreligious and interfaith, and we used interfaith because we interreligious often studies religion as a purely human phenomenon, and we feel that all faiths, religious traditions, are in a way also responses to a transcendent reality. That's why we use interfaith. We actually think that one of the problems in the Western way of dealing with interreligious relationships is that people feel that there's a strong general idea that you can only really relate to people from other religions peacefully if you put your own religious commitments between brackets. And our own experience is that relating to other religious traditions, that's simply not true. People who are deeply religious are committed to certain truth claims, and there can only be mutual understanding if you take that serious. So we feel that actually, if you want to take people utterly serious, you need to take their truth claims seriously and therefore engage apologetically with them.
So you're not going the more relativistic interfaith kind of way. This is something very different.
This is something very, very different because there is a deep. It's based on a belief, deep conviction that that Christ is cross-culturally relevant, that this truth is a transcultural truth, valid for all, and that we want to share it. But that in order to do so, you need to realize that everyone you talk to is deeply embedded in a certain cultural context, in a community, and even as a Christian, you are also. There is no supracultural truth abstracted from a context. That's why we like the idea of transcultural truth. There's something you can share transculturally. But even the Christian truth, of course, was sort of originates from a specific historical, cultural context. But Christians believe that it's universally relevant.
Well, as you know, we talked before we started recording. You've seen some of my work, and I'm so thankful to see it mentioned in your fine volume here. But years ago, I was involved in apologetics to new religious movements in the West, and I came to see serious problems with it. And I'll be honest, it did leave many times a bad taste in my mouth about apologetic approaches. You recognize some of these shortcomings, and you and your co-author are creating a new model. What led you? What did you see in the field that said, you know what, I think some of these Western approaches just aren't doing what they need to be doing?
I think some of our developments in thinking about apologetics are parallel to yours in your search for a new form of apologetics. First, apologetics should be holistic. You cannot really relate merely to sort of the rational aspect of someone. You know, people are embodied human beings. They are emotional human beings. Their way of thinking is shaped by their affections. That is what they feel, what they desire, what they want. By their embodiedness in a community. So it should be holistic. Yet that it should be holistic. Sorry, it should also be contextual, because it relates to people in different contexts where people have different plausibility structures, you might say. There's different things that are plausible for them. There's different things that they accept that are parallel to Christianity or that differentiate them from Christianity. Yet, that doesn't mean that reason doesn't have a place, that argument doesn't have a place. And that's not only true for Christianity, because we believe that we accept Jesus Christ as the way to God, as the supreme revelation of God, for good reasons. That's also true for adherents of other religions. Adherents of other religious traditions often feel that their religion is rationally superior, and you cannot really engage with them unless you relate to those claims to be a rational faith.
Well, you mentioned the need to not only do an apologetic that's embodied, but also culturally embedded. Years ago, one of the then controversial ideas that we tried to introduce was to think of new religious movements in the West as small cultures, microcultures, and then to draw upon the principles of missiology to try and communicate within those subcultures. And as I said, that got some, had mixed reviews, but surely with the model that you folks are developing here, how do you want us to understand the significance of culture, not only for those we relate to, but our own cultural assumptions that we may not even be aware of?
Yeah. I think I like the idea of small cultures in a way, because there is a certain tradition of interreligious apologetics that treats religions as coherent worldview systems that have a certain systematic coherence, that are mainly rational system, and that you can compare with others. So you can do comparisons with worldviews and see which one is most rational, which one is most empirically valid, etc. The problem, of course, is that people that religions are varied amongst themselves, that there are different stresses, different tensions, different foci, and that people even relate to their religious traditions differently. So there are certain commonalities in Islam, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, but you need to be very aware of the differences. And one of the things we do in our book is that we actually say, when you relate to different traditions, we need to focus on a certain substream, not necessarily because it's the most dominant substream, but we need one example to see how it might work in other ways. Then, of course, you see that within those substreams, people relate differently to the substreams. Some people are part of a religious community, but are in a way innerly disengaged. They're disoriented in their traditions. There are others who are deeply committed. There are some who are deeply committed to the community, but not to the truth. Others are deeply committed to the truth, but not to the community. So people live in it differently. That means be aware of differences between traditions and of different ways people relate. So that means also that apologetics then also should be very dialogical. Listening should be an important part. Where are you? What is happening in your life? Where might God actually be leading you if we believe that the God of Jesus Christ is also present in other places?
A couple of years ago, I read an intriguing article. I think it was from a social psychological perspective that was informing theology. And it talked about the need to shift from dialogos to diapathos. That is, we want to retain the logical, rational component of interactions, but we also recognize that human beings are emotional creatures where emotion and reason work together. In your work, have you seen anything that leads you to believe that emotions are a significant aspect of an apologetic approach?
I guess so. Yeah, and we should be very careful not to say, you have a reason, an aspect of reason, an aspect of the will, an aspect of the emotions, as if you can neatly separate them. Right. That is what was used to be called faculty psychology. You have different faculties and they relate to each other. In fact, our emotions and our reasons are deeply intertwined. Augustine already said it's very hard to argue with someone who doesn't want to listen. I've tried that with teenagers. So be aware of that. Be aware how it shapes reasoning, but there are also points of contact. It's not that your emotions are mainly barriers. There are also points of contact. I remember engaging in a long-term dialogue of about half a year. I had weekly meetings with a Buddhist friend. And there was a certain tension in his thinking between the fact that according to his Buddhist theology, personal relationships were to be bypassed because he needed to disattach himself from all personal engagement because it kept himself away from what was truly worthwhile. And yet, in fact, he had a deep personal attachment to the most important persons around him. So actually there, his emotional attachment, which he felt to be drawing him away from the truth, was a point of contact, a bridge we could build because it was something we shared, and about which I could explain how actually those deep attachments would be understood from a Christian perspective that says actually that God is personal, God is love, and therefore God gives deep meaning and ultimate significance to the personal relationships that we experience.
I think that's very helpful. In terms of this embedded idea and being more self-aware in our apologetic processes, I remember years ago, I think it started in the UK and then it came over to the US. There was an Alpha course. It was an attempt to try and introduce Christianity to other people. And I think one of the shortcomings was it often asked questions that made sense to the church, but it didn't really connect with the people we said we wanted to connect with. How can we pursue an interfaith apologetic process that is more sensitive to where the other is culturally embedded?
Part of it is listen, of course. It will take time. You can, of course, converse in different ways at different levels. Some conversations are really valuable, even if they're conversations in passing. I remember meeting for the first time in my life a Sikh on a railway platform in Paris. We had a conversation for about 20 minutes, which I think was valuable. we talked about our faith commitments, had some valid exchange, but I didn't understand anything in depth in Sikhism, that would need more. So take time, and that also means that as a Christian community, some of us are better placed to talk to specific communities than others. Let's not suppose that someone can do all. And it also means that you may want to listen to Christians that are living in specific environments, that may know, say, Hinduism much better than Westerners would do, and that may know much more about the varieties of Hinduism. One of the things we really learned about Hinduism in this process, when I discovered that in much Western apologetics, when it dialogues with Hinduism, it dialogues mostly with Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, which is a sort of Brahmanic philosophical Hinduism. But talking to Hindus, I realized that this is a very specific form. It's an elite form. It's also a form that many people in India themselves experience as oppressive. It's a group that claims that they are the real representatives of Hinduism, and others might not even recognize that. And it's great to realize that there are different forms of Hinduism. Some are much closer to primal religion. We actually, in our book, chose to dialogue particularly with Bhakti Hinduism because of its strong focus on devotion to a god, which is a great point of contact with Christianity.
Well, was there any reflection on the idea to an openness to mutual apologetic influence? If we're asking ourselves to utilize and draw upon a better apologetic with people in other religious traditions, many times I have seen Christians shut down and unwilling to consider the ideas of the other. And I recognize they consider them spiritually dangerous and so on, but doesn't there need to be a mutual openness even in the apologetic and persuasion effort?
I think there is a mutual openness, and in that sense, it is true that apologetics, a real apologetic dialogue, implies the risk, you might say, of conversion to the position of the others. Otherwise, I'm not truly open. That is actually why the question becomes really important. Why do I actually have confidence, sufficient confidence in Christ, so that I can listen to others without feeling vulnerable? That is why we call our book Humble Confidence. This is about humble listening, yet being confident that we do not need to be scared to listen to others. Furthermore, as Christians, I think we have reasons to believe that we can learn from others while remaining Christians. We believe that we believe that the Holy Spirit is not shut up in the church. We believe that God the Creator can be known in other places, and that means that in dialoguing with others, we can learn, we can be enriched, we can be sharpened. So I think that a confidence in the ultimate significance of Christ does not exclude the possibility of learning, but we also need that confidence in the ultimate significance of Christ if we want to be truly open to others, and without a fear of others shutting us down. So you might say that when you engage in apologetic dialogue, there are two risks. On the one hand, there is a risk that you say, oh, actually, it doesn't matter what I believe. It's not really important, so I can merely be listening to others. I think that cannot be an Orthodox Christian position. We cannot say, that it doesn't matter whether Christ was risen or not, because our whole understanding of the hope for the world depends on that. So we should say it does matter. On the other hand, there is a risk, of course, that I know that it does matter, but I can't face it, therefore. and therefore I shut down upon myself without really listening. I'm just engaging with others in order to get my own arguments across, but I'm not really listening to what the others bring to the conversation. And that demands, of course, a significant growth in our own understanding so that we are able to engage with confidence.
Well, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I do love the title of your book, Humble Confidence. And it struck me at a time, for several years now, I've been working on trying to understand the psychology behind the theologies that evangelicals bring to the encounter with other religions. And one of the things that psychologists are really looking at now is the concept of humility. And it's usually defined as a rational awareness of the limitations of how much you know about another's politics or religion and what. And
yeah,
that seems to me to be a little short-sighted. I disagree. I think instead of we need humility, certainly, but I like this idea of humble confidence. How did you and your co-author come to develop just that basic idea that you used in the title?
Partly it is because I think we are aware that what we try to do in this book will not easily be welcomed. I think on the one hand, there are those who will say, if you engage in conversation with others, realizing that you yourself are rooted in a specific historic context, you are already a relativist. You know, they believe that we should do apologetics because we need to defend that we have an absolute truth. I believe we relate to an absolute truth, but we do not have it. That we have an absolute truth which is based on universally accessible rational basis that everyone who can see or need to accept. So they will not like our book. On the other end, there are many who would say, but if you engage in apologetics and interreligious dialogue, you're not really listening. You're only trying to get your idea across. So I think that what we do is not a middle road. It's not like being a bit relativist and a bit absolutist or so, as if you can do that in the middle. We try to show that you can be fully confident and fully opened, and in order to already relay some of the opposition we expect and we experience in dialoguing about this book, we say from the very beginning, we think that a combination of humility and confidence is possible. But it's also a pointer, I think, to the fact that in order to engage in apologetic dialogue well, it's not just about knowing the right arguments, being a quick debater. It's really about your attitude in relation to others, and your rootedness in the ground of our faith, which is Christ. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Well, I was also pleased to see that you're aware of the challenge of secularism. You yourself mentioned that was the environment you had been raised in, but you're dealing in the interfaith context. Do you think perhaps Western apologetics has been too focused on secularism and hasn't provided enough tools and reflection on navigating the waters of religious pluralism?
It seems that that Western apologetics basically has one type of audience in mind, and that is the audience of, say, almost the secular scientists. You know, that's the ideal opponent is say the Oxford atheist. You know, there's a couple of problems with that. By doing that, you effectively raise this Western atheist or Western secularist or Western indifferent person or Western postmodern person on a pedestal, as if this is the most intellectual position possible and we need to relate to that. Actually, there are forms of Hinduism, Buddhism, that are very intellectually profound, maybe intellectually more profound. So we shouldn't put that position on a pedestal. It also means that you are developing apologetic arguments that will not relate to most people in the world. In percentage-wise, the number of atheists and agnostics is shrinking, and it's small compared to, say, Muslims. Muslims are not worried about science and religion. They're not worried about whether God exists. They're worried about completely different things. Yeah. But furthermore, there's not only an issue in relation to the rest of the world, there is also an issue in relation to the West itself. If you have that approach to apologetics, you basically make the well-educated secular person the norm of what the Western thinker does, and the West itself is so more divided. That's that it's socially layered in terms of education, but you have new spiritualities. You have now people sort of locked up in conspiracy theories, very different again. And we need in the West to be very aware of these different audiences, and we might be able to relate to a intellectual secular culture and not have any way to converse with these other groups. Or the other influences in the West, because you relate very well to in your work to new spiritualities. But it's not merely the case that you have these small groups of people who have committed to these new spiritualities. You have also these broader influence of these new spiritualities that many people play with, like, the number of people who do not consider themselves religious, but when confronted with death, they like the idea of reincarnation, is significant in our society. That's just one example.
Yeah, it's always been curious to me when I see a lot of times in media accounts, even in Christian materials, to refer to so much to seculars, and we certainly need to be aware of that. But it seems that the multi-faith, the interfaith context needs to be considered as well. You note in your book that you're writing for an upper graduate and graduate level, or undergraduate and graduate level. What key takeaways would you want to have for that audience or other readers, where your book is presenting a new model that might be difficult, but I think it's got some promising things to say?
Yeah. I guess it demands some focus for reading this book, but that's always when you start pointing it to a new direction, you'll need to do that. I think that there are a number of lessons there that pastors can heed to, and that they can easily share sort of with broad sectors of their congregation. And that is, if you want to speak to others, try to grow in confidence. Know why we have confidence in Christ, and why it's the case that when we are confident, we don't need to fear others. We don't need to close in on ourselves, and teach each other to have the courage to truly listen and confidently witness to Christ, so that's helpful in a much more wider setting. And I think broader, or more specifically in an academic context, it's about having people realize that what we consider rational is profoundly shaped by our communities, our histories, our mental makeup, etc. But that doesn't make our rational choices purely relative. It just makes them located. And that means that we also need to ask, what is the value of the specific location of the Christian community in a tradition that starts with Jesus Christ?
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed your book. My hope is that folks will take a look at this and then maybe take some of those older apologetic volumes dealing with other religions that use more of a traditional rationalist kind of refutation of worldviews approach, and set that aside and give this thesis a consideration. It's a wonderful book. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, John. John, great to talk to you.
Well, I want folks to look at the program notes for this episode. You'll find a link to Benno's bio and a link to the book that he authored with Kang-San Tan. Again, that's Humble Confidence, a Model for Interfaith Apologetics. And I highly recommend it. Want folks to seek that out. Until the next episode of Multifaith Matters, I'm John Moorhead. Thanks for watching and listening.